was a cold Friday night in a small town. The streets were quiet, with only the sound of wind blowing through the empty roads. Jason, a college student, was driving back home after a late study session. His stomach growled loudly, and he realized he hadn't eaten since lunch. As he passed the familiar golden arches of McDonald's, his hunger took over. The lights were still on, and the drive-thru sign glowed like a beacon. Jason pulled into the parking lot and noticed that the restaurant looked strangely empty for the time. Usually, there were a few cars or people inside even late at night, but tonight it was deserted. Maybe it's close to closing time, Jason thought, but a sign on the door said, "Open 24 hours." He shrugged and decided to go inside instead of using the drive-thru. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and a cold draft followed him inside. The smell of fried food filled the air, but there was something off about it, like the grease was old and burnt. Jason looked around. The place was eerily silent, and the fluorescent lights flickered every few seconds. "Hello? Anyone here?" he called out. A second later, a man appeared behind the counter. He was wearing a McDonald's uniform, but it looked outdated, as if it belonged to another decade. The man's name tag read Roger. He had a pale face and dark circles under his eyes, but he smiled widely at Jason. "Welcome to McDonald's," Roger said in a low, almost robotic voice. "What can I get for you?" Jason hesitated. Just a Big Mac meal with a Coke, please." Roger nodded, his smile never fading. Coming right up. Jason took a seat near the counter. He glanced at the play area in the corner. The colorful tubes and slides looked old and dusty, like they hadn't been cleaned in years. He shivered and looked away, deciding to check his phone while he waited. A few minutes later, Roger placed the tray on the counter. "Your meal is ready." Jason walked up to grab it. The fries looked fine, but the burger was strange. The bun was slightly burnt, and the lettuce had a weird gray tint. The Coke was in a plain, unbranded cup instead of the usual McDonald's logo. "Is everything okay with the food?" Jason asked. Roger tilted his head and smiled wider. "It's fresh. Enjoy your meal." Not wanting to be rude, Jason took the tray back to his seat. He picked up a fry and popped it into his mouth. It tasted normal, so he decided to take a bite of the burger. The first bite was fine, but as he chewed, he noticed a metallic taste. He looked down at the burger and saw something shiny sticking out of the meat, a small piece of metal. "What the hell?" Jason muttered. He spat out the food and walked back to the counter. "Excuse me, but there's something wrong with this burger," he said, holding it up. Roger stared at him, unblinking. "It's how we make them here," he said. "That's not normal. I'm not eating this," Jason snapped. Roger's smile faded. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You should finish your meal." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He backed away and decided to leave. He tossed the tray onto the nearest table and headed for the door. But as he reached for the handle, the door wouldn't budge. "It's locked," Roger said from behind him. Jason spun around. "Why would you lock the door? Let me out." Roger tilted his head again, his eyes glinting under the flickering lights. "You haven't finished your meal." Jason's heart pounded. He grabbed his phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. He looked around the restaurant, hoping to find another exit. The play area had an emergency door. He ran toward it, but when he pushed the handle, it wouldn't open either. "Help!" Jason shouted. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, but they weren't coming from Roger. They were coming from the play area. Jason turned to look, and his breath caught in his throat. Something was moving inside the tubes, a shadowy figure crawling through the brightly colored tunnels. It stopped at the end of the slide where it peeked out. Its face was pale and childlike, but its eyes were pitch black. Jason stumbled backward, tripping over a chair. The shadowy figure crawled out of the slide, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. It grinned at Jason, showing rows of sharp teeth. "What is that?" Jason yelled, scrambling to his feet. Roger laughed, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It was distorted, echoing through the empty restaurant. "It's our special guest," he said, "and it's very hungry." Jason bolted toward the kitchen, hoping to find something to defend himself with. The shadowy figure scuttled across the floor, its movements quick and jerky. Jason grabbed a metal tray and swung it at the creature, but it dodged effortlessly. He ran deeper into the kitchen and found a door leading to the storage room. He slammed it shut behind him and locked it. The room was dark, with only the faint glow of an old freezer light. Jason leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. From the other side, he heard scratching. "You can't hide forever," Roger's voice called out. Jason looked around the storage room. His eyes landed on a stack of old uniforms and a pile of discarded toys, Happy Meal toys. But they weren't normal. Some had missing limbs, others had melted faces. He picked one up, and it started to laugh maniacally. He dropped it and backed away. Suddenly, the scratching at the door stopped. The silence was deafening. Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, hoping for a signal, but instead, there was a message on the screen. "You're next." The freezer door creaked open, and icy air poured into the room. Jason turned to see the shadowy figure standing inside, its grin wider than before. Behind it, other shapes began to emerge from the darkness. More pale faces, more black eyes. Jason screamed and bolted out of the storage room, dodging the creatures. He ran back into the main dining area, but Roger was gone. The restaurant was even darker now, the lights flickering erratically. He spotted the drive-thru window and ran toward it. He climbed onto the counter and pushed the window open, squeezing through. As he dropped outside, he felt something grab his ankle. He kicked wildly, breaking free, and ran to his car. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, but finally managed to start the engine. As he sped out of the parking lot, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The McDonald's lights were off, and the building looked abandoned. Jason didn't stop driving until he was miles away. When he finally pulled over to catch his breath, he noticed something on the passenger seat, a Happy Meal box. His blood ran cold as he opened it. Inside was a single note, "See you next time." Jason's hands trembled as he threw the Happy Meal box out the car window. It landed with a dull thud on the empty road, but something felt wrong, like it was heavier than it should have been. His breath quickened as he realized he couldn't just drive off without looking. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, he opened the car door. The night was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the wind. Slowly, Jason walked to the box, heart pounding in his chest. It was darker now, the road illuminated only by the flickering glow of his car's headlights. He crouched next to the box, squinting in the dim light, and gently nudged it with his foot. Nothing happened. Jason hesitated before crouching and peeking inside. It wasn't empty. Inside the box was an old yellowed photograph. His breath hitched as he realized what it showed, a picture of him sitting inside the McDonald's, right before he had taken the first bite of the burger. "How was this possible?" Jason whispered to himself, his voice trembling. The photo had something else. In the background, blurred but unmistakable, was the shadowy figure from the play area. It was perched at the corner of the room, its black eyes staring directly at the camera. Jason staggered backward, dropping the box. As it hit the ground, he heard something rustling inside. He leaned closer despite the growing dread in his chest. The photograph was gone. Before Jason could process what was happening, a low growl echoed from the trees lining the road. He froze, whipping his head toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just darkness pressing in from all sides. Then, another sound, a faint tap, tap, tap. It was coming from his car. Jason spun around, dread pooling in his stomach. The passenger side window was fogged up, but there was something on it. No, it wasn't something, it was someone. A handprint. Jason's first instinct was to run, but he knew he was far from anyone who could help. His phone had no signal, and running into the woods would be a death sentence. Summoning all the courage he had left, he stepped closer to the car, gripping his keys tightly in his fist like a weapon. When he was close enough, he saw a face pressed against the fogged-up glass. It was pale, just like the creatures at the McDonald's, but this one's mouth stretched unnaturally wide into a jagged grin. Jason's stomach churned at the sight. The figure slammed a hand against the glass, cracking it slightly. Jason let out a startled shout and turned to run back toward the road. He had only taken a few steps when a deafening screech filled the air. He froze and looked back. His car headlights flickered and then went out, plunging him into total darkness. "Hello?" Jason called out shakily. The reply came from behind him. "You forgot your meal." He spun around. Roger stood there, holding another Happy Meal box in his hands, his smile stretching unnaturally wide. The shadows danced unnervingly around him, and his eyes were pure black. "I don't want it," Jason shouted, backing away. Roger tilted his head, his grin never faltering. "You don't have a choice, Jason. How do you know my name?" Roger took a slow, deliberate step forward. "We know everything about you. Once you walk through the golden arches, you're ours." Jason turned and sprinted toward the woods, branches slapping at his face as he plunged into the darkness. He didn't care about the risks anymore. Anything was better than staying near that thing. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot filled the air, but Jason realized it wasn't just his footsteps. Something else was following him, moving fast and erratically. Out of breath, he stumbled into a small clearing and fell to his knees. Tears streaked his face as he struggled to think. There had to be a way out of this. "Where are you running, Jason?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed unnaturally, bouncing between the trees. He looked around wildly, his vision blurring with panic. A hand rested gently on his shoulder. Jason let out a blood-curdling scream and swung around, only to find the shadowy figure from the play area crouching in front of him. It cocked its head, watching him with its black, empty eyes. Then it lunged. Jason woke up gasping. He was in his car, parked outside his house. The engine was off, and the golden light of dawn stretched across the quiet suburban street. For a moment, he thought it had been a nightmare, a terrible, twisted dream. But when he glanced at the passenger seat, his blood ran cold. There sat a single, pristine Happy Meal box. Jason didn't touch it. He left the car and went inside his house, locking the doors and closing all the curtains. For the first time in a long while, he skipped classes that day. He stayed home, pacing and racking his brain for answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, but every time he peered outside, there was no one there. By nightfall, the tension became unbearable. Curiosity, or maybe sheer madness, took hold of him. Jason opened the box. Inside was another photograph. This one showed his house, specifically his bedroom window, and staring into it was the pale-faced shadow creature. Jason spun around, staring at his closed curtains. His throat tightened as he approached and peeked through the fabric. His window was dark, but there was movement outside. And then he saw it. The creature was there, on the street, just standing and staring. Behind it stood Roger, his smile brighter than before, with dozens of shadowy figures crowding the sidewalk. They all waved at Jason. The golden arches loomed behind them, glowing faintly as if to remind Jason of the promise. "See you next time," came the whisper, faint but clear. Jason didn't sleep that night, or the nights after. It was only the beginning. Jason's life became a living nightmare after that. Days blurred into nights as the paranoia consumed him. No matter how hard he tried to move on, he couldn't escape the feeling that they were always near. At times, he would see shadowy figures flickering in the corner of his vision, only to disappear when he looked directly at them. He kept the lights on 24/7, but even the brightest bulbs couldn't chase away the dread that seemed to fill every shadow. A week after the McDonald's incident, Jason woke to the sound of his phone vibrating. He scrambled to grab it from his nightstand, hoping it was a friend or family member, but the number was unfamiliar. Hesitating, he answered. "Hello?" The line crackled before a chillingly familiar voice responded. "We miss you, Jason." It was Roger. Jason's blood ran cold. "Leave me alone. I'm not coming back there," he shouted, his voice shaking. The voice on the other end chuckled softly, like it was amused by his fear. "Oh, but you never really left us. Look outside." Jason's hand froze midair as he was about to hang up. Against his better judgment, he walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. The street below was empty. No cars, no people, no movement. For a moment, he felt relief, but then his eyes adjusted to the dim light. There, across the street, was the same Happy Meal box. Its edges gleamed under the faint glow of a flickering streetlight. Jason stumbled back from the window, his chest tightening with terror. The phone call ended abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence. His trembling hands fumbled to call the police. When the operator picked up, Jason poured out his story: a crazed man at McDonald's, a stalker leaving Happy Meal boxes, and shadowy figures outside his home. He didn't care if it sounded insane. He was desperate for help. "We'll send someone to check it out," the operator said cautiously. Jason sat in his living room, every light blazing as he waited for the police. Eventually, there was a knock on the door. "Mr. Wheeler, it's Officer Trent," called a calm, authoritative voice. Jason opened the door a crack and peered out, only to see a tall police officer standing on his porch. His uniform was crisp, his face professional but kind. "Thank God you're here," Jason stammered. The officer nodded. "You said there was suspicious activity outside?" Jason gestured to the window, across the street. "There's a box, but..." When he glanced through the window, the box was gone. "No, it was right there," Jason exclaimed, his voice rising. Officer Trent frowned. "Let me take a look around." Jason stood nervously at the window, watching the officer step into the street. The darkness seemed to swallow him, and the faint sound of his boots on the pavement sent shivers up Jason's spine. The officer's flashlight flickered as he moved back and forth. He radioed in briefly, but gave Jason a thumbs up to let him know things were fine. Suddenly, the flashlight went out, and the street fell silent. "Officer Trent?" Jason called through the window. There was no answer. Jason grabbed a kitchen knife and debated running outside, but every instinct screamed for him to stay put. Before he could decide, the front door burst open. Officer Trent stumbled in, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Lock your doors, lock everything," he shouted, slamming the door behind him. Jason could barely process what was happening. "What happened? What did you see?" The officer shook his head, his voice trembling. "There was something out there, something not human. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't natural." Before Jason could respond, the lights in the house flickered violently, then went out altogether. In the sudden darkness, Jason clutched the knife, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. Officer Trent grabbed his radio, but only static came through. And then they heard it. A low guttural growl echoed from somewhere inside the house. "That wasn't there before," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay close to me," Trent said, drawing his weapon. The sound of scraping claws against wood filled the air, coming closer and closer. Jason's throat tightened as he scanned the pitch-black room. Shapes moved in the dark, their silhouettes impossible to define, but their presence was undeniable. "I see them," Jason breathed. "Stay calm," Trent replied, aiming his flashlight at the movement. The beam flickered briefly, illuminating a pale face with hollow black eyes and a jagged grin. It wasn't alone. Behind it stood more figures, their bodies contorting and twisting as they shuffled forward. "Run!" Trent shouted, firing his gun. The bullets ripped through the air, but the figures didn't flinch. Instead, they seemed to multiply, filling the room with writhing darkness. Jason sprinted toward the back door, Trent close behind. As they reached the door, it slammed shut on its own, a deafening crash that shook the house. Trent fired another round, but his hands were trembling now, his resolve unraveling. One of the creatures lunged at him, its fingers elongating into razor-sharp claws. "Get out of here," Trent yelled as he shoved Jason toward the basement door. "Wait, you can't!" Jason's protest was cut short as the officer was dragged into the darkness, his screams fading into silence. Jason had no choice. He bolted down the basement stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. In the stifling darkness, he crouched, gripping his knife with white-knuckled hands. The basement was damp and smelled of mold. Jason tried to calm his breathing, but every sound echoed like a drumbeat in his ears. The creatures were still upstairs. He could hear them shuffling, growling, and scratching at the walls. Jason's phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. He nearly dropped it in fright. There was another message on the screen: "We'll always find you." Before he could react, the basement lights flickered on, revealing something that made his stomach churn. The walls were covered in faded, peeling McDonald's posters, but these weren't normal advertisements. The smiling clowns and cartoonish characters had twisted, grotesque features, wide, haunting eyes, sharp teeth, and bloodied hands. On the far wall, Jason saw a mirror, but when he looked into it, his reflection didn't move. The figure in the mirror grinned, stepping closer. Jason's scream echoed through the empty house as the light bulb shattered, plunging the basement into darkness. Jason was never seen again. His disappearance was the talk of the small town for months, but no one could explain the strange sightings of pale, shadowy figures lingering near the abandoned McDonald's at night. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, you could hear faint laughter echoing through the empty streets. And if you ever walked near the boarded-up restaurant, you might find a single Happy Meal box waiting for you by the door. See you next time. Months passed, and the small town tried to return to its normal, uneventful life. Jason's disappearance was an open wound that never quite healed, though. His name came up in conversations, whispers from concerned neighbors, cops who worked on his case, even his friends who hadn't seen him since that night. But as time wore on, his story faded into the past. Like everything else, people had to move on. It was easier that way. Yet, the haunting didn't stop. It was a warm Friday afternoon when Lisa, a local high school teacher, drove past the old McDonald's. The building was boarded up, the lights long since gone dark, but something tugged at her. Something she couldn't shake, a growing dread. Ever since Jason had disappeared, the air seemed thick with an uneasy silence whenever anyone passed that place. People avoided it now, not because it was abandoned, but because of the stories they'd heard. And sometimes, when the sun dipped just below the horizon, they said you could see movement inside. Probably just kids being foolish, Lisa muttered to herself, trying to ease the nerves that had settled in her stomach. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the feeling persisted. That evening, she found herself unable to shake her curiosity. She parked near the drive-thru, just like she had when she'd passed by earlier in the day. The eerie quiet of the place seemed to amplify in the night air. The restaurant had long been forgotten, and the remnants of its better days lingered on like a haunting echo. She glanced around. No cars, no people. Only the dim streetlight cast against the once familiar golden arches, now broken, rusted, and neglected. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, the message unfamiliar. "Come back, Lisa. We miss you." She stared at it in shock for a long moment before typing out her response. "Who is this?" The response came quickly. "It's your old friend Roger. We haven't seen you in a while." Lisa's hand trembled, an icy chill flooding her spine. Roger? There was no way. That was impossible. He'd been working the night Jason had gone missing, and no one had seen him after that. He hadn't returned to work or even been heard from. The text didn't make sense. She tapped out another reply, fighting the overwhelming urge to delete it and forget the whole thing. "Where are you?" The screen blinked, and another message appeared, "You know where." The chill in Lisa's gut deepened, almost paralyzing her. She turned off her phone, stuffed it back into her bag, and hurried back to her car. Her hands shook as she drove away, eyes glancing nervously into the rearview mirror as she sped down the street. The sensation of being watched didn't leave her. It only grew stronger the further she went. There was no one in the parking lot, no one to be seen through the windows. But somehow, she could still feel it, the presence of something standing in the shadow of the McDonald's, waiting. The following week, Lisa returned to McDonald's, this time with more than just a lingering curiosity. It was late in the afternoon, and she couldn't stop thinking about Roger. No one knew where he went after Jason's disappearance, but every instinct she had told her that he might hold the key. She didn't know why she was doing it, why she couldn't let go of this dark, unnatural pull, but she had to find answers. When she arrived, the restaurant seemed as desolate as ever, dusty, abandoned, but somehow familiar, just the same as it had been since Jason's nightmarish ordeal. The sign was still hanging low, swaying slightly in the wind. Its letters, McDonald's, were half illuminated by a solitary street lamp, flickering strangely. Lisa paused before crossing the threshold into the restaurant, wondering whether it was a mistake to return at all. Yet her steps betrayed her and led her inside. The moment she crossed into the restaurant, the temperature dropped. The faint smell of old fry oil and rot stung her nostrils. Lisa could feel a heaviness in the air, a quiet, oppressive sense that filled every corner of the room. "Hello?" she called, the sound of her voice filling the emptiness around her. The faint echo felt wrong, distant, as though it wasn't her voice she was hearing. But then the familiar figure appeared. Roger stood behind the counter, smiling at her with a crazed grin stretched wider than it should have been. His eyes were black, no trace of white in them, and there was something off about the way his skin shimmered unnaturally under the flickering fluorescent light. "Welcome back, Lisa," Roger said in a slow, drawn-out voice that made her skin crawl. "It's been a long time." Lisa stepped backward instinctively, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Her breath caught in her throat. "You've been wondering," Roger continued, "why you can't leave, haven't you? Why you still feel like you're here, like we're watching." He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he picked up a tray from behind the counter, the surface slick with something dark and unsettling. He placed a single meal in front of her, a happy meal, just like the ones she had seen Jason staring at in his last days. She could barely stomach the sight, but there was something magnetic about it, something that locked her in place, drawing her closer to the tray. "You left us all," Roger whispered. His voice grew louder, more intense. "You left, but you're already one of us. It's been decided." The back of the restaurant lit up just slightly, as if showing a path leading further into the shadows. "Don't worry," Roger said, stepping closer to her now, his breath hot and stale. "It's not too late. You can stay with us, stay where we belong." The walls behind him blurred like smoke, and in their place, several figures appeared, figures with the same twisted features as Roger. Pale skin, dark eyes, grotesque smile. They surrounded her slowly, circling. Lisa could feel the weight of their presence like invisible hands wrapping tightly around her chest. Panic surged through her. She ran, tripping as she bolted toward the door. Her foot caught the edge of a chair, and she tumbled forward, landing hard on the floor with a gasp. Through blurred vision, she looked up and saw Roger standing over her, his pale face inches from hers, grinning wide. The last thing Lisa saw before the darkness overtook her was the sign outside, McDonald's, flickering above a familiar pair of golden arches. A shadow seemed to stretch beneath it. It wasn't until morning that Lisa's car was found, abandoned near the drive-thru. The police found the restaurant locked up, as it always had been. No signs of forced entry, and nothing was out of the ordinary except for the terrifyingly quiet air that lingered. The officers found no trace of Roger, no indication that anyone had even been there the night before. But after Lisa's disappearance, something unsettling began to happen. Strangers passed by the boarded-up restaurant at night and reported hearing faint whispers of laughter carried on the breeze. They said sometimes, if you stood close enough, you could hear the sizzling of fries and smell the faint scent of cooked burgers, even though there was no one there. A few months later, a small, weathered box was found on a park bench in front of the McDonald's. It was a Happy Meal, with the same jagged grin on the logo. But inside this time, there was no food. There was only a note. "We will always find